Okay. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Welcome everyone to a
Good
special
afternoon.
seminar focusing on the newly created CITF Databank. My name is Tim Evans and I'll be your moderator today. I'm the Executive Director of the COVID-19 Immunity Task Force, as well as a professor and director and associate dean at the School of Population and Global Health of McGill University. Before we get started, I've been asked to share some instructions as we are providing simultaneous translation into French, and we'll have a bilingual questions and answers period. Bienvenue à tous et à toutes au séminaire.
Welcome to the seminar on the COVID-19 Immunity Task Force Databank. My name is Dr. Tim Evans, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I've been asked to share some instructions as we are providing simultaneous translation into French, and we will have a bilingual question and answer period.
On the screen, you will see an icon of a globe. Choose off if you are bilingual and want to only hear the live feed. English attendees, you should select the English option so you can hear the entire event in English. The presentation will be in English, but the question and answer period will be bilingual. Au bas de votre écran Zoom, vous verrez
At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see an icon of a globe. Choose off if you are bilingual and want to only hear the live feed. To French attendees, you should select the French option so you can hear the entire event in French. The presentation will be in English, but the question and answer period will be bilingual. Please select your language preference now.
Please go ahead and select your language preference now. Okay, we'll move now to the land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that we're speaking to you from our place of work at McGill University, which is on the land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. We'd like to acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which we are gathering today. Just a few quick words about the COVID-19 Immunity Task Force. It was established almost 3 years ago in April 2020, 1 month into the pandemic, with a mandate to catalyze, support, fund, and harmonize knowledge on SARS-CoV-2 for COVID-2 immunity for federal, provincial, and territorial decision makers to inform their efforts to protect Canadians and minimize the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. To date, we've supported almost 120 studies, 119, and they are distributed across the Canadian jurisdictions, as you can see on this map. Next. The CITF, from its beginning, has had a mandate for data sharing, in which, in our guiding principles document, we have attempted to establish an ethos in which the rigorous gathering and rapid sharing of data to inform Canadians and to advance the broad public interests overrides any considerations of personal/group advancement. So I'm now pleased to introduce Dr. David Buckridge, who's been the lead data management and analysis person for the CITF Secretariat. He's also a professor at the School of Population and Global Health at McGill University. David?
Thank you very much, Tim. It's my pleasure to present to you the work that we've been doing on the Databank. And I'd like to start out by just saying a few things about what are the key characteristics, why you should care about this Databank and why it's important. And I think it comes down to these 3 areas: the breadth of the scope of the Databank, the valuable content within the databank for further research, and underlying the databank, robust data governance. So The scope, as Tim mentioned, is over 119 studies supported. We believe over 70 of those are in a position to share data centrally through the data bank. And these studies have been conducted really across the country and over the time course of the pandemic, and perhaps more importantly, in multiple different populations. So these have been studies that have really sampled populations by their population risk status, for example, and not specifically focusing on people with severe disease or disease cohorts. So it's really quite a broad perspective across the country. And also the content, as I mentioned, is very scientifically valuable. We do also make available statistical aggregates, but today we're going to focus for the most part on individual level data. These are data through self-report, also extracted in some cases from databases, and also including laboratory measurements. In addition, these data are very well described with metadata. They're collected in a common way wherever possible. And as I'll get into, we also try to harmonize across different data sets so that they can be easily compared. And then fundamentally, why we can do this data sharing in this way is because we've established this robust data governance, where we've really tried to have all of the studies obtain the same common consent elements from, in terms of what type of consent they're obtaining from participants, and then by establishing very clear data sharing mechanisms and oversight, some of which I'll review today. So these are really the three things, if you can, for why I think this is really an internationally unique research resource: the breadth of the scope, the nature of that content, and then the robust data governance. So just to say a bit more about the types of data, I've already alluded to these three types, but just to be clear, we have what are called metadata, or data about data. And so every study that's included in the data bank, and in fact, every study we've supported, is very carefully cataloged in a collaboration with the Maelstrom Research Group led by Isabelle Feltier. They've developed a very nice standard strategy for describing epidemiological studies, including the study population, the design, and the key variables in data collection. So that's the first type of data, these really rich descriptions of what is in the data bank. The second are these statistical aggregates, where the individual level records from a study have been summarized in some way. These are considered anonymized in the sense that the risk of re-identification is very, very low for these data sets. And so generally speaking, we release these openly. So they'll be released on our website. In fact, already some of these data are openly available on the website. And these are mainly in the form of seroprevalence estimates of different populations. And these really form the foundation of a lot of the analysis and information sharing we do with different decision makers. And today, the focus is going to be on this third type of data, the actual individual level records, which are shared with the CITF secretary in a de-identified way, which means the direct identifiers are removed, replaced with a code, and those records are shared with the CITF. Now, because these data are obtained from individuals and they can be identifying potentially for individuals, we make them available through what's called a restricted access mechanism, which I'll get to in some slides that will come up in a second. So those are three types of data: metadata, statistical aggregates, and individual level data, which I'll focus on for the most part in this presentation. So this map looks quite similar to the previous one. This is showing you just the subset of approximately 70 studies in a position to share data with the data bank. And you can see they're from across the country with a very similar distribution to what was shown before for all the studies supported by CITF. Now, this slide gives a very interesting perspective on the different populations I mentioned before that are included in the data bank. What you have here is essentially these sort of two pie charts. The center chart gives the more general categories, and the outer chart gives more specific categories than each general category. The size of the slice of the pie here corresponds to the number of studies that include each population. So you can see the biggest slice there is for general population studies, but we also have many studies on occupational groups, higher risk groups, as you can see there, due to their health conditions or pre-existing conditions, healthcare workers, pediatric populations, and so on. So really sampling from across many different types of populations across the country. Now, getting to the actual variables, as I mentioned, these are quite detailed individual records. So you get data from these three different domains that are shown on the left: demographic and health background data, COVID-19 history, and then laboratory measures. Not all studies are in a position to collect all of these variables, although the vast majority did collect most of these variables. And as I mentioned, we created what are called common data elements, so that each of these variables has a preferred format in terms of how it should be collected, and also clear definitions in terms of what it means to try and facilitate that the data are collected in a common way across all studies. However, despite people's best efforts, it's sometimes not possible to always collect the same variable in exactly the same way across all studies. And so this is where the process of harmonization comes into play. So as we receive an individual study data, the team will try and map the actual variables collected in a given study to those core data elements I described before. And if it's not a perfect match, then we have to consider harmonizing across a group of studies or a set of studies so that they have some consistency in how the variables are recorded. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. But this is a process that adds further value to the original data sets by creating these summary data sets that have variables represented in a common way. So where are we in terms of progress? As I mentioned, we have approximately 7 studies that are in a position to share data with the CITF Secretariat for being placed into the data bank. Right now, over half of those 39 have actually entered into formal data sharing agreements between the institution of the primary investigator for the study and the Secretariat, which is McGill University acts on behalf of that. 14 of those studies have actually shared data with us, and you can see the numbers. That's in some almost 50,000 participants across those studies. So we're seeing larger and larger numbers as we have more studies. And we've currently created 1 harmonized data set with 4 of those studies from the 14 that have shared with us. Now, these numbers will continue, not the 70, but the numbers above will continue to tick up over time as we move through this process. And we're in a position where we're adding approximately 1 or 2 studies a week into the mix. Okay, what's there now? Those 14 studies is just a quick snapshot to give you a sense of what's there. We have 7 longitudinal studies, 10 that have a focus on seroprevalence, and 3 that span multiple studies. You can see for the most part, they're general population studies, but there are a number of other groups that have been included in these studies, including some occupational groups and pediatric populations. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about accessing these individual level data that are in the data bank. I'll start first by just giving you the general picture, then we'll go into some specifics into how you can use our portal to access data. So it is important, as I mentioned before, to understand the governance process. So what allows us to share these data so widely? It really starts with, on the left, with the CITF supported study. So the individual investigator conducting their study needs to ensure that they have obtained appropriate informed consent to allow them to share their data from the study in a de-identified way with us here at the CITF Secretariat, and that the people have also consented, the participants have consented to allow us then to further share it through the restricted access mechanism I'll describe. It is possible in some cases where data were maybe extracted from an existing data bank, for example, and our research ethics board could give a waiver for that type of individual consent. But in any event, we need to make sure we have either that consent or a waiver that would allow the type of data sharing we want to do. Once we know that's in place, then the institution where the study was conducted enters into a data sharing agreement with the Secretariat. Once that's all in place, then we have the ethical and legal foundation established to be able to share data. So then the data set is actually transferred to the CITF Secretariat. And that's when our data management analysis team gets to work to examine the data, working with the study team to make sure that we have the quality appropriate and that the core data elements are mapped to their variables. And then we enter into the harmonization process I described. After that point, we move into the environment where the data can now be made available for external researchers. And I'll go into that process in greater detail, but essentially researchers can browse for variables and identify the data they want, and then enter into a data access agreement with the Secretariat, at which point we release the data. So this may seem somewhat complicated, but it really is a process that has to be in place to ensure that we really respect the privacy and the confidentiality of the data for the participants, and to ensure that we respect the consent that they have signed. And through this mechanism, we're allowed to share these data for further research. So what does it look like then from the researcher perspective when you want to access data? So you, starting on the left as an access applicant, you would go to our website, which would direct you to our data access portal. You can see variables and studies that are available both on our website, but also on the portal. You need to select the variables you want and then complete an application form. That form then goes to what's called our data access office, which does an administrative validation to make sure that the form is completed and supporting information is there. Once the application is complete, it's handed off to an arm's length data access committee, which formally reviews the application and either approves it or declines to approve it and provides feedback to the applicant on what would be needed to make the application possible to be approved. So that's the overall process. And I mentioned a couple of groups in there that are important to understand their roles. I mentioned the Data Access Office is really the one that manages the whole access process in terms of the administration of the portal, answering any questions that researchers might have as they're trying to go through their application process, or if the researcher has specific questions about data sets that aren't immediately able to answer by consulting the data portal or our website. The Data Access Committee is as I mentioned, an arm's length committee that is composed of 5 members with different types of experience relevant to what we're doing here. They meet periodically to review applications and approve, as I mentioned, or indicate what further information might be needed before approvals can be given. So those 2 groups. And then what do they do? What do they actually review, and what needs to be there to be approved? So the documentation is actually relatively light. Applicants need to provide a research summary that gives justification for the requested variables and statistical analysis that they're going to be conducting. And this is not a long document. It's relatively straightforward. The details are on the Access portal. They also need to provide evidence of that their research has been approved by a research ethics board, or that they have a reason for not applying for REB approval, and then the CV of the researcher. And then what is looked at is whether or not the research is in accordance with the guiding principles of the CITF, which are reasonably broad, but it has to be consistent with those principles. The research has to be deemed scientifically sound, the scope appropriate, and there needs to be some justification for why they need the variables and the data sets they're asking for. Specifically, if the requested data could identify Indigenous peoples or communities, we also request justification for the use of those variables, and we will demand evidence that the applicant has appropriately engaged with the implicated communities or peoples. You can see the FAQs on the right, a few points. There is no cost currently associated with this. This is available really quite broadly for different types of research across the world. And the length of time it takes to get your request approved may depend on the complexity, but we're aiming to turn these around on the order of 2 to 4 weeks quite quickly. Okay, so once you actually get the data set, there are some conditions of use. So when you receive an individual level records to do your research, you'll need to enter into a data sharing agreement with the Secretariat, which will define the responsibilities in terms of how you must maintain the data. When you publish the data, there are certain obligations in terms of how you cite the CITF as well, for example. It's also important to know that the data are provided for access to the researcher for the proposed project. And so if there is a meaningful change in the project, the researcher needs to let the CITF know, of course, so that we can update the terms of the access. But this is all clearly defined in the data sharing agreement that researchers enter into once they receive a data set. Okay, so now let's get into more of the specifics just before we wrap up to take some questions. So as I mentioned, one of the main types of things that we do is collect metadata in a very structured way about all the studies. And so there are 2 different ways you can access those data. Perhaps the easiest way to get started is to go to our website. And if you go to the CITF Databank part of our website, you can actually see a listing of what studies are currently currently in the databank. So there's data from those studies in the databank. From each of these studies, you can then click on them and go through to more detailed metadata. It's also possible to access more specific information about what's available in terms of harmonized data sets through the portal, and I'll come to that in a second. But this is really just summarizing the individual studies here. So the data portal, as I mentioned, is where you'll get into the specifics about creating your application and also looking into the details of what's available in terms of harmonized data sets. So here's the overall process for accessing data. So you go to the portal, you create an account, and then it's a bit different depending on whether you want to access original study data or you want to access harmonized variables across multiple studies. If you want to access the harmonized data sets, you just simply move across the steps you see going from left to right. If you want to access original study data, then you would just create the account and move right to this step here of creating and submitting a data access application and possibly have some communication with the team. But for the harmonized data access, you create the account. You can then explore harmonized variables, and I'll give you a little shot of what that looks like here. So here's a screenshot of our data access portal. And if you click here where the red circle is on explore variables, you'll see a listing of all the available variables. And you can see here's about 163 currently variables available in this harmonized data set that we've made available. And they just get listed down here. You can, of course, filter these. And so by clicking over here, you bring up these filters that allows you to filter if you're, say, only interested in pediatric populations, for example, or there's certain types of variables that you really want, you can click these here and make sure that you get those variables. Now, you can also add those variables. There's a process I won't go through right now, but once you've identified the variables, you can then select them and essentially add them to a cart, just like as if you were doing your Christmas shopping. And then you can create and submit a data access application. So here's an example now where you can see somebody's added 23 variables to their cart here, and they're now going to open up a request. And what this does is it literally just carries across that variable listing to your data access request, and you can fill out other information that's required for the data access request. Okay, so that summarizes it. So as I mentioned, there's these steps you go through at the top here. You just go through them one after the other on the portal. If you're interested in the harmonized data and you want to make a request there, if you want the original study data, you just create an account, communicate with our team, and then we'll get you going through the rest of the steps. So that pretty much summarizes, what the data bank is, what the issues are around access, and then specifically how to use the data portal for access. Now, before I hand it back to Tim to start the questions and answers period, I'd just like to take a moment to thank a few folks who've been really critical here. First of all, I want to thank all the CITF funded research teams that have shared data to date with the CITF Databank. They've really made it possible to do this data sharing and to do further research, and without them, it just wouldn't be possible. So I want to thank all those investigators that have really taken up the ethos that Tim mentioned earlier. I'd like to also acknowledge the efforts and the expertise of the Maelstrom research team under Isabelle Faultier. I mentioned them earlier. They've been really quite helpful in terms of the cataloging, but also in terms of the harmonization. And so really, really critical for bringing this data bank to a reality. And then finally, I'd also like to acknowledge Alexandre Bernier and Man Zawati from the Center of Genomics and Policy, who really have helped us to put in place the solid data governance framework that is the foundation, the ethical and legal foundation for this data sharing. And with that, I'll give it back to you, Tim.
Well, merci beaucoup, David, for that very clear presentation.
Thank you very much, David.
And everybody who's worked so hard in getting this up and running, incredibly exciting. So I know there will be lots of questions, and so we're going to move into those right away. I just want to encourage people to stay in the language option they prefer and enter your questions into the Q&A section below if you haven't already done so. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. I'd like to also welcome 3 other members of the CITF data and analysis team who will help David with answers to your questions. And these individuals are Dr. Tanya Murphy, who's our data manager, and research assistants Hannah Swale and Ahmed Mustafa Ahmed. So thank you all 3 of you for joining us along with David. Now we do have a question in the chat, and so I'm going to read that out. Thank you to Monsieur Jean-François Boivin. What are the obligations of the researchers with respect to open access to results of the analyses that they carried out with the task force data? Someone answer that? David, you need to unmute if you're going to be heard. You've just muted. Yeah, nope. That's better.
You hear me now? Okay, great. Yes, I can take that question. So thank you, Jean-François. So the question here is obligations of researchers with respect to the open access to results of the analysis that they carried out. So I assume, Jean-François, you're talking about if someone receives a data set from the data bank and does research with it, are they under some obligation then in terms of publication? So there is no requirement that they return the results that they perform or they produce to us. So the data sets provided to an external researcher through the data access mechanism, the individual level records I described. And then there are certain obligations they have in terms of citing in any publications they do the task force. And that citation would be to as well what we call a marker paper. which would include all of the different PIs that have put data into the data bank. And so that's a mechanism whereby the original PIs are both cited and also the CITF is. But I think if your question is about whether there's any further obligation on those researchers to make any derived results or anything available, we currently do not oblige them to return derived results to the data bank, but we will accept derived results if it's of value to further enhance the data bank. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, please put another question in there and we'll try and get to the rest of your question. Tim, back to you.
Thank you, David. Do any of the other team members want to comment on that question? Okay, we have a question from Angela Crawley. First, she says, thanks for the presentation, well done. What are the long-term plans to maintain this data resource?
I can take that too, I guess. So I was reflecting on before this pandemic, actually the start of this pandemic, I think I was talking to folks that were still analyzing data from the 1918 pandemic and still deriving insights from it. And so I think, what we've done is created a resource and very carefully created a resource that a key part of the consent elements was that these data could be maintained indefinitely. So we have not put, now there are exceptions for certain data sets, but for the vast majority of data sets in the data bank, there is no time limit on this. And that was structured purposely like that. Now, of course, resources are required to continue to operate the data bank. And as I mentioned, we've probably got another year or so to keep bringing data into the data bank. But resources will be required over time to maintain access to the data bank, but at a much lower level. So the specific mechanisms, I can't say out terribly far into the future, but the intent is to keep the data bank, first of all, to make sure that we can get all the data into it, and then to keep the access going as long as it's useful for research.
Great. And maybe I could just add to that. I think that part of our work of the task force with the Public Health Agency of Canada is to try and preserve this as what we call a public good. And so we're very much wanting to make sure that this is sustained in such a way that it can be accessible to folks. We have another question, and I think it's going to be from someone by the name of Dr. Tanya Murphy to the hosts and panelists. Is there an obligation to make publications open access, i.e. not behind a paywall?
And I think that's perhaps where Jean-Francois was getting at. I didn't get that point. There is no, currently we're not requiring anybody to make their publication open access using our data, although that is increasingly becoming the standard for all research in Canada. So, sometimes that is a financial barrier for some researchers. So we didn't want to make that a formal requirement, but we certainly encourage that. And I think increasingly it's going to be the requirement for almost all research that's publicly funded in Canada.
Great. Now we have a question from Dr. Upton Allen. And the question is, will the data bank be accessible to international researchers? If so, are there conditions on this?
That's an easy one to answer. Yes and no. So yes, the data are available for international researchers, and there is no limitation on that. They would have to meet the same criteria as other researchers. They would need to provide evidence of REB approval and all the other steps. Now, just to be clear, the data bank itself must reside in Canada, and that is in fact one of the conditions for governance of the data bank. But individual research requests can come from researchers anywhere in the world, and we will release data for research to them if they meet all the requirements that were laid out.
Okay, and there's no cost, David?
There is currently no cost. That's correct.
So again, the public good dimension of this is being reinforced beyond Canadian jurisdictional boundaries. Okay, we have a further question, if we can, from Ryan Caron. He comments, first of all, that it's a great resource. My question is in regard to the data sharing mechanisms once the request is approved by the DAC. What tools or methods are used for the researcher to access, brackets download, the data once approved? And offering some apologies that this is listed somewhere in online documentation. Thanks.
No, great question, Brian. And this is not listed anywhere, so I don't think you missed anything here. So I'll tell you what we have right now and where we're going to go to probably with this. So the current strategy is that we have a essentially a web-based file sharing system that we host locally here at McGill. And so we can make accounts available on that infrastructure, and then applicants would be given access to that along with credentials to go in there and access a data set and download it. However, we're also working with the Borealis data repository as well, which is based at the Dataverse here at McGill, and there's, I mean, different universities are part of this, but we're using that as a mechanism to both describe in a structured way our open data sets, as well as each study data set and the harmonized data sets. And so that's a way where we can actually give, as I mentioned, these what are called direct object identifiers or persistent URLs to each data set that we create and share. And all the metadata can be also put there in a very structured manner to facilitate discovery of individual data sets and of harmonized data sets. And so right now that it's a bit in flux, the ability to put personally identifiable data on that repository. So we're only putting open data sets there, but ultimately that might be a mechanism down the road whereby we could also make the restricted data sets accessible through that mechanism. But for now, we're only publishing metadata and open data sets on that repository, and the actual restricted data are maintained within our information systems here. And as I mentioned, we'll be using that web-based data sharing mechanism for researchers to access the data sets.
David, maybe I'll
yeah, please jump in.
Add a little bit more practical information on that. We can prepare the a downloadable data file or files in the format that you want for standard statistical software, and then you would also receive a data dictionary to go with those data.
Great, thanks, Tanya. So we have questions building, and I can tell by the nature of the questions, we've piqued interest because they're getting more and more technical. So thank you from Sahar Sahid. Thank you for the presentation of the initiative. Can you give an estimate of how long the process could take from submission to data access?
And Tim, I wonder if we should take Angela Crawley's question too. They look quite similar. I could probably answer both together.
We'll take Angela's as well. Can you please describe the contractual process in place to facilitate this data sharing? How long would a contract take to negotiate to carry out the data release? Is it rapid?
Yeah, so great questions. So currently we have planned for our data access committee to meet monthly, but reviews and approvals could occur more quickly than that, potentially. So that would mean that we're hoping to turn around these data requests on the order of 4 weeks. So again, we're getting started, so please be gentle with us at the outset here, but the idea is that it's a fairly straightforward and rapid process. So once the dossier is ready, in the sense that all the materials are there, it needs to be reviewed by the data access committee according to the criteria I mentioned before. And then of course we have to extract the data set. And as Angela asked, we have to create a data sharing agreement. Now these things can happen in parallel. So we can, as the request is being made, our team will be looking at that request and be preparing the data set so that it's ready to go once the data access committee approves it. Now the data sharing agreements, we have a very standard data sharing agreement already prepared and in place for researchers who are getting a data set from the data bank. We don't anticipate very much change in those data sharing agreements because the conditions are what the conditions are. So we don't anticipate a lot of negotiation between the CITF and the researchers institution. So that is a bit of a wild card, but in other examples of data banks like this, that's gone pretty quickly. So we're optimistic, and for example, in genomics and similar kind of data banks, they managed to release the data on about the pace of about a 2 to 4 week turnaround time. So that's the target we're setting for ourselves.
All right, So 2 to 4 weeks. Very good. We have another question from Jennifer Taher. It's how will description of research questions / analysis be controlled for? In other words, 2 independent researchers asking the same question with the data set. So if you have 2 data sets where the questions are the same, how is that being managed?
I'll take that too, I guess. And I mean, that's not really for us to manage, to be honest. I think it's up to the researcher to kind of know what's been done and where the novelty interesting questions are. Of course, there might be value in trying to reproduce or recreate results that others have done by directly trying to, perform the same analysis in the same data and see if you can recreate those results. That's a valid line of inquiry, presumably better if you know you're doing it that way than not. So we don't really have a formal mechanism to try to control, in a sense, what questions are being answered. It's really up to the, the research community to ask what questions they would of the data. However, we do encourage networking and certainly for all of our studies, although when somebody makes a research data request, we do not go back to the original PI and ask their permission. We do notify them, though, that the data are being shared. And their contact information is also available through our cataloging of the studies. So although there is no, I would say, obligation for those individual researchers to answer questions or engage in further research with somebody else, I imagine many of them would be interested to hear if people are doing further research with their data. And so, that's entirely, we work essentially as a matchmaker in that regard. We'll let everybody know who those researchers are, and people can reach out to them and contact them if they're so interested.
Okay, so I think the short answer I'm hearing, David, is that you could have multiple data sets answering the same question in the data bank, and so people can track those. Tanya, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll just say that there is a tab on the portal for approved projects, so you could browse that. There are no approved projects yet, but as projects get approved, they will be listed there.
Great. Great. Okay. And so I have a note to organizers from Angela Crawley. Perhaps you'd like to consider the Universal Data and Biological Materials Transfer Agreement that COVAR-Net has been using. It has been vetted by 29 plus institutions in Canada through an intensive consultation review process of 25 institutions. Happy to share with you offline if interested. It is now a non-negotiable MTA for academic institutions, given the vetting process we have undertaken to implement it. It can be used very fast, within days, once shared with providers, recipients of data / materials. Thank you, Angela. Does anybody want to comment on that?
Just, I'm very impressed. Well done, Angela and COVAR-Net. I'd be delighted to see that, Angela. Thank you. We've created a similar data sharing agreement. We've had a lot of experiences with the 70-odd different studies we've been putting data sharing agreements in place in too, but we're always happy to benefit from that kind of work. So thank you very much, Angela. Look forward to following up.
So I have another question, which is how recent is the data in the data bank and how quickly do you expect to be able to add additional data?
Well, so as I mentioned at the outset, the data collected in the data bank, really the first studies were started right at the outset of the pandemic, and they've been continuing throughout. So we have data really that spans from early 2020 up till people are still collecting data right now. So those data will continue to come in. Adding additional data, as I mentioned, we have 39 data sharing agreements in place right now from the approximately 70 studies, we're continuing to share those data sharing agreements. And so there's a process, as I mentioned, once the data sharing agreement's in place, we then go into the mechanics of having the data set transferred from the study institution to the CITF, and there's a data processing step and all that kind of work, and then the harmonization and so on. So we can do this all in parallel, and we have a number of studies in play, but we're as I mentioned before, we're adding about 1 or 2 studies a week is what we think in terms of availability. So it does depend a bit upon how quickly the different study teams can work with us, but for the most part they've been very, very collaborative and working very hard with us to get this done. So That's about the pace. So at that pace, we should probably have all 70 studies, in less than a year, but that's the pace that we're moving at.
Maybe I can add a point about
Yeah,
the
please go.
recency of the data. Since we get the data after the original study team has had time to process the data, there is some delay, quite a bit of delay to get it, to give them time and then for the documentation. But then as new data from new study visits or routinely collected lab measures come in, after once it becomes a more routine process, then we expect those to be a little bit more recent. But there, we don't want to oversell the fact that there's new data coming in, but there is a delay in between study visit data collection and when we can have it ready, or when study teams can have it ready.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tanya. So we don't wait for the full study to be completed, particularly for longitudinal studies. They'll have multiple waves and data collection events, and then we ask them to share the data once they've completed collection for a wave and they've assured data quality, essentially, that's when we ask studies to share data with us.
Great. Okay, we have another question, and it relates to how strict is the data review process?
I'm not quite sure what process that's referring to. If it's a data quality when we first get the data coming in, it's quite strict. And I certainly, as I mentioned, we have these core data elements. And Ahmed, who is with us, works very hard to make sure that he can line up every variable that they give us with those common data elements or core data elements. And there's a fair bit of back and forth, to be honest, between Ahmed and the study team in terms of making sure. I don't know, Ahmed, do you want to say anything about that at all, or?
No, that's exactly right. It takes some time to map the data to our core data elements and then have it up there on the portal as a harmonized data set.
Yeah, I think you mentioned before, it's about 3 weeks, I think, usually of the back and forth once you start that process of the study giving you access to their data set, and then trying to get it into that final format where we're happy with the quality.
Yeah, so it's about 3 weeks, and as Tanya said, after that, the follow-up visits are usually easier once we establish a flow with the study team.
Yeah. Great.
There's also all the data documentation, so because we aim to have it well documented so that when people get questions about, from reviewers on the paper about how a variable was measured, they'll have that information and not need to go back. Yeah.
Great. I think the question about data review process was referring specifically to the data access committee review process.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Well, I can answer that question too. So you get a bonus answer then, I guess. So the answer to that one is it's very clearly laid out in our data access policy. So there's a series of points, which I summarized on the slide, that the data access committee is being asked to review. And they essentially relate to, as I mentioned before, is the research consistent with sort of the mission and the goal of the CITF? Is it scientifically sound research? Do they have REB approval? And is the team in place to do it? And then there were a couple of specific questions there as well, as I mentioned, in relation to if the applicants are asking for certain types of variables that might identify Indigenous peoples or communities, there's a further review there. But it's not, the data access committee is not like a scientific peer review committee. They're not pouring into and going through every application in great detail. They're really going through that almost like a checklist to make sure that it's proper research that's coming from a research group that has the right credentials, they have the right REB approval, and so on. And so they're just that's what they're making sure is in place. And so that's why we think we can turn this around relatively quickly. And this is a model that's been put in place before. We're not the first to do this, although this is relatively novel on this scale and scope for this type of data to have this kind of data bank.
Great. We have another question from Alice Litosh. will each study team receive their own portal to share the data with CITF? What will the process look like?
Good question. And yes, so the sort of web-based file sharing system I mentioned that we host here at McGill, we actually originally put that in place first to interact with the study teams. So that's the same mechanism we use for studies to give data to the CITF or deposit data in the bank. So every study team receives an account with their own credentials in that. It's kind of like a Dropbox or OneDrive sort of thing, but it's just a different software. And essentially they receive their own account and they can then upload their data set. And then if Ahmed, for example, has questions, he can then put a new data set in there for them to see where he's made some modifications, and we can have a back and forth that way. So when studies are ready to share their data with the CITF Databank and they have in place the data sharing agreement, as I mentioned before, then they're provided with those credentials and they can move a data set over into that environment for us.
Great. Okay, and a follow-up from Alice, which is, first of all, she thanks you for that response and asks, is there a limit to the number of data we can submit at one time?
Not really. I mean, that's not been an issue. So, I mean, these data sets are not that large because we don't have like genomic data and, imaging data and so on. And so I suppose in theory, there is a limited size of that web-based file sharing system, but we haven't run across that issue yet. So if there's any concerns about sort of the volume of the data, we can coordinate ahead of time, but so far there hasn't been a problem at all.
Yeah, we've had studies upload data sets with tens of thousands of rows and dozens of variables wide, plus the documentation, and not had any trouble.
Okay, so looks like we got enough space to handle whatever can be uploaded. Great. Very good. Well, would any of the team members like to say anything else with respect to some of these issues on how to access and use the data bank?
I do. I have
Yeah,
one that point that hasn't come up and is maybe not immediately clear in the portal, is that there isn't currently an electronic way, in the software, in the online portal, to select your inclusion criteria. And so, I mean, you would list that, but then you would meet with us to see how, what your potential sample size would be given your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So don't hesitate to contact us. We can start looking at that with you while you're preparing your application.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tanya. We not yet put in the functionality to allow people to kind of slice and dice the data sets and see really what's there. We are working on that, but in the interim, and I think this goes for everything really, is, it is, hopefully we've made this understandable to everybody, but there is a bit of complexity here. And so, if you feel like you don't know where to start or it's not clear where to go next, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll be delighted to help you, go through the process and learn as well from the challenges you're having to try and make it smoother for others. So we see this definitely as a process that's ready to go, but it's going to get smoother with time. And if you have any issues, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Great. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions. We're getting close to the top of the hour. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you for the great attendance and great questions. If you have additional questions, you can direct them to data@COVID-immunitytaskforce.ca. The slides from today are already on the CITF website on the appropriate events page, both dans les deux langues, in both languages. A recording of the webinar will be available by next Tuesday on that same page. And please share the knowledge with fellow researchers and scientists. We certainly hope the contents of the data bank can further research in Canada and around the globe. So I would just like, before we close today, is to announce the next CITF research results and implications seminar. You can see it on the slide at the moment. It will be on the 25th of January, 2023. That's in the new year. And it's entitled How Social Determinants of Health Affected the COVID-19 Pandemic in Canada. You will find registration links to that seminar in next week's CITF newsletter and CITF monthly review magazine. If you do not receive these products, you can subscribe by the task force homepage, which is listed here at the bottom, COVID-19 Immunity Taskforce.ca. So these are the ways you can get in touch with us and stay abreast of our news. We encourage you to follow us on social media as well. That's all for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thanks to our presenters and thanks to the great work of David and team leading the data bank. Happy holidays and a happy new year. And we look forward to seeing you all again at a future CITF session. Thank you. Merci.